So I'm Kris, and let's start with the story. And to me, the story of DevOps starts here. This is actually the marble room of the Antwerp Zoo, where back in April 2009, we had a Cloud Camp Antwerp. And it is at that event where actually one of the seeds that eventually led to what we today know as DevOps was planted. It was where Patrick Dubois and I decided that, well, we should run this small conference. We should get our friends involved, and we should have that conversation about how development and operations should get closer to each other. And that's where we decided that we would run something. We didn't have a name yet. That name came much later. That name came somewhere in June of that year after the talk from John Osbal and Paul Hammond at Velocity. Dev and Ops 10 deploys a day, operations and development working together. And a lot of other people had influences in this. But somewhere in late October, beginning of November 2009, we had the very first event in Gent. About 60, 70 of our best friends coming over to Gent to discuss and to think about how we could do software delivery better, how we could do these things. And a couple of people took that idea and went on to do similar events in Mountain View, in Sao Paulo, and different parts of the world. And the first couple of years, we typically had one event in Europe. That was Hamburg, Göteborg, Rome, and then 2013, things started to move faster. And a couple of events in the other parts of the world. Around 2013, as I said, things started to move faster, and many more cities started to do this. Many more cities started to run their own event. And last year, we had the 10th year celebration of DevOps Days back in Ghent, where we started. And if you look at the very first event, we had people from 3 different backgrounds. Well, not different backgrounds, but more 3 shared backgrounds. We had a lot of people who were heavily vested in open source. We had been doing open source development and open source implementations for the better part of the previous decade. We also had people who had solid background in Agile, in how development teams could work together better. And we also had a number of people who were taking their first steps into what eventually became the cloud. We were talking about virtualization platforms. We were talking about early container technologies, and those kind of topics. And basically at the crossroads of these 3 topics is where the DevOps movement started. And if people ask me, what is a good definition of DevOps? To me, it's a global movement that was set to improve the quality of software delivery. And we started that in Ghent back in 2009 based on our open source experience. And as you can see, this slide is a little bit bloody. It's taken from a presentation Patrick and I gave back at DevOps in Antwerp, where the theme was vampires and werewolves, where we tried to picture the difference between development and operations people. And I like to reuse that slide because in a way, nothing has changed. So many things have changed, but a lot of things have stayed the same. So DevOps Days is where it started, where the idea started. And if you look at these graphs, they haven't been updated. And obviously 2020 will be a dip because we didn't have that many physical events. Today, there's over 900 people organizing these kinds of events and spreading knowledge and sharing knowledge. And there's also other events like this one, which are focused on the DevOps topic. So there's a lot of community built around the idea of software delivery can be done better. So to take a step back and to look at who I am, I started my career back in the late 90s as a software developer. I did Java, I did PHP, I did Perl. And at some point, I became the operations person. At some point, I was the one who knew how an application needed to be clustered, how a server needed to be put in a rack. And based on that experience, all with open source technology, we started to result in this thing which today we call DevOps. Next to my day job as basically the senior lead at Inuit, I also run a couple of other conferences. I run Config Management Camp, I run Load Days, and who knows, we might run another delivery conf in Europe at some point. But that means I've been around for a long time. I've been doing these things for 20 plus years now. And that kind of tells me that I learned a lot of things along the way, and I see history repeat. I see things happen again. And that's why we need to continue doing these things. We need to keep talking about what we learned. We need to learn from our mistakes. And obviously I'm opinionated, and obviously also I'm ending up being an old grumpy developer. But we really need to tell people why we're doing these things. And why we're doing these things is because in a lot of organizations, the wall of confusion is still a fact. Development has a deadline. At 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, they basically show up at the operations department and they say, hey, here's some code, here's a tarball. Can you put this in production now? And the operations people respond to, but we don't have machines for this. Where are you going to store the data? How about security? Does this need to be high available? Does this need to be scalable? And they take a look at the code base, they take a look at the tarball they get, and they say, but I can't even install this, and my computer can't install this. It's not going to work. And that problem fundamentally is the start of a long journey of discussions and problems. And that's something we need to solve. And if you look at the history of DevOps days, and if you look at the evolution of the topics we've seen, I always like to look at the open spaces. The DevOps days format comes in a way that in the morning there's formal talks, there's presentation, but in the open space there's people who gather around, discuss different topics, and while they have discussions about these topics, they exchange ideas and experience with their peers. There's nobody standing in front telling them how to do things, but they get the information and the ideas and the creativity from the other people at the conference. And if we look at the topics that have been discussed there over the years, you can see an evolution. So in the early days, we were really talking about adopting Agile, about realizing that an operational department might benefit more from a Kanban approach rather than from a Scrum approach. And a lot of us were looking at startups as examples, like small, agile, young organizations that have really good success stories. We had a couple of poster childs, like the early days of Spotify, Etsy. Those people were really what we were looking up to. If you look at the topics today, we see a lot of discussion about people who never experienced Agile, who've seen fake Agile implementations. Scaled Agile Framework stands for shitty Agile for enterprises. I mean, SAFe is awesome if you consider it a waterfall implementation, but it has nothing to do with Agile. We look at enterprises as examples, which actually aren't really examples, because typically the good examples in the enterprises are like the small, really isolated teams that don't have to touch on anything of it and can just behave like a small startup. And we even start to see anti-patterns which are being talked about. We discuss how to get management included, which is more often than not a real problem. And we see a lot of evolution there. When we talk about the technologies, 10 years ago, we were talking about infrastructure as code. We were talking about tools such as CF Engine, Puppet Chef, and how they would help us to automate things, how they would make things faster and more resilient. We were talking about orchestration tools like mCollective and Noah and Rundeck, or CI/CD tools, back then, Hudson and Jenkins. And now we're not talking that much about the importance of infrastructure as code anymore. A lot of people have forgotten why we want idempotent platforms. A lot of people have forgotten why we want automation and reproducibility. And they look at shell scripts and generating YAML and manually editing YAML again. Some of the things haven't disappeared. Rather than talking about different CI tools, we now talk about pipeline as code. We talk about different orchestration tools. But a lot of the discussions now are about, hey, I'm just going to write this YAML file and kubectl apply, or Helm install. But we're not talking anymore about the real problems we had. How do we reproduce these things? How do we make sure that they stay in the same state? So continuous deployment, continuous delivery, release management are topics we were really learning from back days. We were ending the era of Subversion and CVS, and we were heavily adopting Git as a real tool. And people were not really sure yet how to use it. People were adopting best practices from tools like Subversion by using a lot of branches, and we're eventually realizing that things don't work that way, that when you do really continuous integration, you continuously, frequently commit to master. You stop branching. And today still, we need to convince people to use Git to do trunk-based development if they want to do continuous delivery. It's still a struggle. People like to fall into easy pitfalls. We learned that monitoring has evolved. We had bloated tools, commercial tools that really didn't work and that really didn't do what we wanted them to do. We had tools that needed their own DBA, like Xenos or Zabbix. We had a variety of things that kind of worked, but not really. And John Vincent at some point called out, well, monitoring sucks because of so many reasons. And we've seen a huge adoption in open source tools that tried to solve a number of these problems. Closed communities that were so-called open source actually got forked a couple of times, and we saw the light of tools such as the Kinga, which was a really vibrant community. We saw the Elk stack show up to do actual really log analytics, which before that was something we just didn't have. We have tools like Graphite and Grafana that allowed us to actually have time series, which we could use, and Prometheus. And we evolved from monitoring stocks to monitoring love again. And a lot of the reason why we moved from monitoring stocks to monitoring love is because of that automation. It's because that we started to use infrastructure as code to actually automatically deploy, update, and maintain our monitoring platforms. Decommissioned services also remove them from the monitoring platform and do that automated and not having to spend time wasting editing manually large config files for monitoring tools. So things have evolved there. We became much more flexible and much more agile into building these stacks and to actually reducing alert fatigue. We were also talking about different technologies there. We were evaluating the differences between Xen and KVM, and we're talking about OpenVZ and LXC and how those could help us to do different things depending on the workload of the applications. We were discussing the early days of how Vagrant could help us to give developers a similar platform as the production likes. And we were building things which were resilient with different file system underneath. And in a way, we were looking at what the public cloud was doing and trying to build similar things with open source tools. Tools like OpenStack, CloudStack, Eucalyptus, OpenQRM. At the very first DevOps days, we were actually looking and investigating on how those things were working. These days, we don't discuss anymore what kind of virtualization engine we're using. People just say we're using Docker, 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 not even realizing that that's not a virtualization engine. Docker was an example on how not to work with your community. Docker was the example that was really developer-centric. And the operational discussions came later. But with tools like Mesos and Kubernetes and Nomad, the things we were doing on orchestration level, the things we were doing on storage integration, start to become important again. And where 10 years ago we were discussing how we were going to distributed clustered file systems with 7 cluster, sadly the norm for a lot of deployments in enterprise environments is NFS. And I'm going to let you guess by yourself what NFS stands for. Slight tip. Olaf Kirch, who is one of the NFS maintainers, made a talk at a Linux conference over a decade ago in Germany, and every single of his slides had NFS as an abbreviation. If you find that deck, you get an ID. So we ended up with this. Everybody, DevOps days, every DevOps conference is now talking about Docker, Docker, Docker. Because at some point, some marketing people just said, Docker is going to solve all of your problems. Docker is the ultimate DevOps tool. Well, we've been saying for years, like, it's not about tooling. It is about collaboration. It is about people working together. But this is what helped. So we started to say, hey, these tools will not fix your broken culture, and the tooling hype is not going to help us. It's the fact that there's 10,000 people going to a conference and everybody's testing the technology, but not actually playing with it, not actually using it in production, is not going to help. So the next step was everybody's going to run Kube. And now it's an ops problem again. So the hard thing with the whole ecosystem is there are simple things to adopt, like installing a new tool, or there's the hard way to do things. It's actually trying to change the culture, trying to change the organization, doing the hard work. And we started figuring out, why is that? Why are we just easier to jump on a tool? And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with implementing a great tool and using it the way it's supposed to be used. But it's also an easy way to just ignore the culture part, just ignore the fact that your organization will need to change if you want to deploy software faster. So let's have a look at what we did in the past. A lot of people say ITIL is dead, and a lot of people have never actually seen a good implementation. They sometimes haven't even read parts of the library, because that is what it is. It's a library. ITIL is looked at as the last mile, the people who say no, the guardians of production, and the useless meetings at Friday morning at 10 a.m. where people who have absolutely no feeling with what technology is about just say yes or no. And that's what it's looked at. And what it actually is supposed to be is a library of good practices, where you think about reducing risk, where you think about stability. Now, what if we would reduce that risk way, way, way earlier? If we could let machines take those decisions, if we could lower the downtime of platforms, and what if rather than Friday at 10 a.m., we could do that constantly? And that is actually what went wrong. A lot of people say ITIL is wrong, ITIL is something we don't want. But once they learn the language and once they understand what those people are trying to achieve, and I'm not talking about the people who literally follow the book without understanding what they're doing. But if you really look at reducing risk, automating all the steps you want to take, and speed that up 1,000th time, we're basically doing automation. We're basically doing what we think we want to do. The same with DevOps, the same with Agile. A lot of people say Agile is dead because they've never seen Agile work. They've seen waterfall implementations with stand-ups. They've seen ticketing systems being used. They've seen quarterly plan meetings where management and the old Prince2 project managers were hiding in a room, and they came out and they had the next quarter planned up, and they had the idea like, hey, developers, you're going to build this in the next 4 months, and now you're going to do stand-ups, and you're going to do sprints, and you're going to be Agile. That's not Agile. That's good old waterfall. So Agile, in a way, struggles with the same problem as DevOps. The actual good implementations are not the default. So who killed DevOps? Well, we did. I mean, I, for years, was giving a talk titled 7 Tools for Your DevOps Stack. And the part of the talk, which was the important part, was that it was not about those tools. It was about humans collaborating. But what most people got from the talk is like, hey, those 7 tools are the ones we want to play with. And they implemented them all. We spent years discussing Puppet versus Chef versus Ansible versus where the actual discussion should have been, why are you still deploying manually? Please use a tool. Pick one. The marketing people who told us Docker is the ultimate DevOps tool were definitely not going to help us. So it's kind of for us to blame that we were not spreading out the good message or not strong enough. And then there's the recruiters. They definitely killed DevOps because the first thing they started doing was sending out job advertisements looking for DevOps engineers. And when I get the request for a DevOps engineer, I still don't know what the customer is looking for. Are they looking for a developer? Are they looking for an ops engineer? Are they looking for a developer who also has to be on call and has to manage the platform, has to do everything he has to get a platform in production? What are they looking for? Typically, they want somebody who does it all for the price of a junior. And we all know where that's going to end up. Ken Mugridge found a nice tweet a couple of years ago where somebody was actually trying to hire a DevOps engineer and they were willing to pay $0 for it. And that's kind of the right price, because obviously DevOps is not a job title. And then the organizations who hire DevOps engineers typically put those DevOps engineers in DevOps teams. So they have a team of DevOps engineers, they have a team of agile people, and a team of collaborators. And they're all in different silos. It's not how you do it. You don't put another silo in between the developers and the operations people and call them the DevOps team. It's not the team in charge of tooling. It's not the team in charge of delivery. There are some small exceptions where actually people rebranded their functional teams as DevOps teams because they had now both developers and operations in the team. Could make sense. And then there's the other thing, like certification. How can you be certified in DevOps? How can you be certified in culture? It's really hard to certify people like that. DevOps Day's 5th anniversary, we had the idea to give out certifications as a joke. And if you read the small print, you can see that we gave everybody a badge. And this is Bernd's badge. And it says he's now certified as a master in DevOps by the University of Dev and Oops. The reason why Bernd is in the picture is because he actually beat us to that joke with about a month, because at DevOps Days Berlin, a month before, they also handed out the fake certificates. They even had another catch to it. Each year you need to come back to renew your certificate. And that is kind of what most certificates are. They're vendors trying to get another revenue source. Vendors who basically say, hey, we know how you use this tool, we build it, we say that you can do this tool, which is not something we can do with a culture, with a mindset. So yeah, in a lot of organizations, this is the challenge. You go in, people have been doing a DevOps transition. They've been doing all the right ways, all the wrong ways. And management still doesn't like it, so they go find somebody else till they find somebody who actually tells them what they want to hear. Just like when they want to do an agile transition, they don't actually go for the agile transition until they find somebody who settles them with safe. End result, new titles, new names, nothing changed. There's the exceptions, the organizations that do want to change. But they get beaten up by people saying, you cannot do DevOps in an enterprise. There's too much different there. You need to do it completely different, which is absolutely not true. It's just going to take much longer because there's much more to change. There's much more resistance in those organizations. And you can change those large organizations, but it's going to take more time. The fact is that most large organizations are not even close to DevOps. Their culture is so broken that they keep lying to themselves that they are, while they actually push people out. So 10 years of struggling, 10 years of working, and where are we today? Sadly, in a lot of organizations, this is where we are. We don't get a tarball anymore. We just get a Docker image, or even just a description for a Docker image. And we don't know where to store the data. We have security issues in the containers. We need to reinvent how to monitor this. People are putting backup agents inside their containers. The containers they ship are not reproducible. They've been built locally on some person's machine from libraries he has around and files he's been copying around. They're absolutely not reproducible. So on a technology level, we really have been running in circles. Some organizations have adopted, some organizations have learned, but we see these new things adopt. We see these new things pop up, and we forget about the best practices. We forget that it isn't about implementing Prometheus. It's about automating the things so that we don't need to spend time on tuning the false alerts. It's about making sure that we don't have those nodes being monitored if they don't exist anymore. That's what gave us monitoring love. So with the rise of resume-driven development and hype-driven development, and one of my favorite, like YOLO ops, because American startups, their business model is to sell to VCs, not to actually have customers. And with the whole cargo culting problem, it's really hard to do DevOps in most organizations. Change management is still really hard. Most change transitions are really the 20% of early adopters, where you need to find the peers in the organization who really want to do things differently. 60% of those people will wait. They will go like, nah, we'll see. And then there's 20% who's going to say, nope, gonna do this. We're out of here. There's the obvious success stories, but they're not always success stories. Sometimes what senior marketing or senior executives tell at conferences is what happens in a really small part of their organization, or just marketing. But it does happen. It is around there. But it's a long journey, and we're definitely still not finished. We need to learn again how organizations have evolved, because the organization that was 20 people 5 years ago might be 200 people today. They have different challenges. They have different technologies that they need to look into. They have new people who join, and those new people need to be retrained because they haven't experienced what we have experienced. They haven't seen the problems yet, and they will be coming with solutions that are actually not solutions because they haven't experienced the pain yet. And obviously then there's new technology to embrace. And for those new technologies, there's right use cases, but there's also wrong use cases. They're not an all-size-fits-one kind of technology. So the biggest challenge we have is that we need to teach people to not shoot themselves in the foot. And that's a really, really hard problem, because a lot of people think that when they come up with an idea, it is the good idea. And they've not taken into consideration all of the side effects, all of the impact it's going to have. So for us, DevOps practitioners, DevOps enthusiasts, we have a really heavy role in the next couple of years. We're going to have to teach people on how to behave, how to learn to see things differently. But we also have to be students. We have to learn new technologies. We have to learn how to work with other people. We have to try to build bridges between people, between different departments, between developers, between troubleshooters. And we have to learn how to be those people. Learn again how to write code, or how to maintain code, how to debug, how to read log files. And we have to evangelize, and we have to keep talking about how to do these things, while also be able to listen to people who struggle. But fundamentally, what DevOps is about changing the way an organization behaves. It is about those people. It is about collaboration, about working together, and about building more quality software stacks. And the tools are only a really, really small part of that. Thank you.
Kris, thank you. Thank you very much for your speech. And let's go for questions. There is one question from audience. What common and what difference do you see between ITIL and DevOps practices?
There's a lot of things in the ITIL libraries which, if you read them, are about resilience, are about reducing risk, are about a couple of best practices. Like testing things, like logging what's happening and creating track of and keeping track of those things. But the problem with a lot of those implementations is that people have not looked at the goals, but actually have been looking at you need to do A, B, C, D, while not understanding what it was actually trying to solve. And a lot of these best practices, a lot of these topics just come back in what we've been automating. But we've been automating them. We've been not doing these things as people who were in a room who have no knowledge of what was happening, discussing these things. No, we built a pipeline, and the pipeline basically said, well, we don't have these, and these things in security. We don't have these, and these things functioning in the application. So I'm going to basically say the tests have failed. And because we have now written proof, machine-decided proof that something is working or not, you don't need to have discussions that can be pushed over by politics. The build is broken. The tests are failing. We're not going to go to production. Or the build is green. The tests are successful. It's already deployed in production because we have upfront reduced that risk. And that is a huge difference, while it's also exactly the same goal. And that's what I'm trying to say. The way people have implemented those things, obviously, sometimes was much worse than the goals they were trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And what are the reasons why people today avoid to learn and adopt ITIL practices?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
What are the reasons why people today avoid to learn and adopt ITIL practices?
I don't know.
Okay.
I haven't seen that many fresh ITIL implementations recently. A couple of years ago, it was really a struggle. Like, yeah, we don't want this automation. Why not? Because it's risky. No, we're actually trying to reduce the risk. The base of continuous delivery is that we do small incremental changes continuously rather than big bulky changes every quarter. And once you had that discussion with those people, they started realizing, oh, wait, you're actually much further ahead in reducing risk than what we're even trying to achieve. But I haven't seen any recent implementations of people who were trying to do something from scratch.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, thanks. And the last question. You have raised a topic on which there is an ongoing debate. If a role of DevOps engineer is an anti-pattern, then how do you call these people separate from the general infrastructure or system engineer? What is your opinion about site reliability engineer role?
So there's two answers to that question. The SRE, I think that the best joke I saw this week was that SRE stood for Service Restart Engineer. And we've been restarting services for the past 2 decades. So I think I qualify as that. But if you look at what Google says themselves about SRE, is that it is their implementation of DevOps. It is how they are actually adopting this culture, how they are actually doing this. And it works for their organization, just like at some point in time, the way Spotify organized their teams to collaborate together, that footprint of that model was how it worked for them at that moment. So I like to look at SRE as an implementation that works for Google of doing better software delivery and improving the quality of software delivery. So to me, they're basically doing something which could be called DevOps. Does that mean that they have good ideas? Yes, absolutely. They have a lot of good ideas on how to do things. But a lot of these things are really tied into how Google works. But it doesn't mean that we cannot learn from them. It's just that they have a good way of doing that. And they have service restart engineers now.
Okay. Is it really about dev and ops these days? In my experience, it's more about overcoming the slow enterprise, rules, regulations, bureaucracy, and etc. Dev and ops collaborate just fine today, and between the two of them, it's now about tooling.
Early on in the years, we said it's called DevOps days because star and ops dev and ops biz dev and sec DevOps and all those things and DBA DevOps. It's basically about everybody collaborating, and it does require a global organizational change.
Kris, answer. Don't listen to.
Oh, sorry, I heard somebody else. Sorry,
yes, it's okay.
So it really is about everybody, and the name. There's 3 hard things in IT. One of them is naming things. DevOps days started out with that problem. Also, the thing about DevSecOps, security was implemented and was involved in the early days. But on the other hand, them saying things like DevSecOps is different kind of gives them a new boost. So we get new visibility, we get new interaction and new interest from those people. But it really is about everybody. We could call it Biz DevOps, Dev Sales Ops, but star just doesn't sound that good.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your speech and thank you for visiting us online. It was awesome to talk with you, and we are going forward. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Okay, thanks. Bye.